Yes, I mean, I've dreamt of singing with him, but of course he died so young that obviously
Elvis, we're talking about.
Elvis, yeah.
Yeah.
To all of us, I guess, when we heard that had happened to him, and it took away the chances of me recording.
The room went silent the moment the phone rang. Cliff Richard had heard rumors about Elvis Presley for years, but nothing prepared him for what he was told that night in 1977. One sentence changed everything. The king of rock and roll was gone. But according to people close to Cliff, there was something else that shook him even more, a private truth about Elvis that he refused to speak about for decades. And now, at 85 years old, Cliff Richard is finally ready to tell the story nobody expected to hear. Back in the late 1950s and early 1960s, both men were dominating music in different parts of the world. Cliff Richard was often called Britain's answer to Elvis Presley. The comparison followed him everywhere. Fans argued about who had the bigger impact. Newspapers pushed rivalry stories almost every week. But behind the scenes, the truth was far more complicated. According to interviews Cliff gave years later, he never saw Elvis as an enemy. In fact, he admired him deeply. Elvis changed music forever. His voice, his confidence, even the way he moved on stage shocked the world in the 1950s. By 1956, songs like Heartbreak Hotel and Hound Dog had turned Elvis into a global sensation. Cliff once admitted in an interview that watching Elvis perform made him realize music could feel dangerous, exciting, and emotional all at once. But that's not even the shocking part, because as Cliff's career exploded with hits like Living Doll and Summer Holiday, he began hearing stories from people inside Elvis's world. Stories the public never knew. Stories about exhaustion, pressure, and a level of loneliness that fame could not fix. And before we go any further, I want to know what you think. Do you believe fame truly makes people happy, or does it slowly destroy the people the world admires most? Drop your thoughts in the comments right now, because what Cliff eventually learned about Elvis may completely change your view of celebrity forever. By the early 1960s, Cliff Richard had become one of the biggest stars in the United Kingdom. Teenagers screamed at his concerts. Record stores sold millions of his albums. And newspapers constantly compared him to Elvis Presley, even though the two men came from completely different worlds. Elvis grew up poor in Mississippi and Tennessee, surrounded by gospel music, blues, and hardship. Cliff, born Harry Webb in India before moving to England, came into fame through Britain's growing rock and roll scene. But despite their differences, music insiders quietly noticed something strange. Elvis was paying attention to Cliff Richard more than most fans realized. According to several entertainment journalists from the 1960s, Elvis had heard Cliff's records and respected the way he connected with audiences overseas. In a later interview, Cliff admitted he was shocked to hear that Elvis even knew who he was. Imagine that for a second. One of the biggest stars on earth listening to your music while the entire world compares you to him. And yet, there was almost no public interaction between them. That mystery followed Cliff for decades. Fans kept asking the same question. Did Elvis actually like him? Or did he secretly see him as competition? The answer may surprise you. According to biographers close to Elvis's inner circle, Elvis rarely spoke negatively about other artists in public. But privately, he noticed who had real staying power. Fame in the music business can disappear fast. One hit song, maybe two, then people move on. But Cliff stayed relevant year after year, and Elvis reportedly respected that discipline deeply. Still, their careers were moving in very different directions. During the 1960s, Cliff carefully protected his image. He avoided many of the scandals that destroyed other celebrities. Meanwhile, Elvis was trapped inside a machine that kept demanding more movies, more tours, and more appearances. According to a 2018 investigation by Rolling Stone, Elvis's schedule during certain years became almost impossible to manage. He barely rested. The pressure never stopped. And then came the darker side of fame. People close to Elvis later claimed he struggled badly with isolation. He was surrounded by crowds every day, yet somehow felt completely alone. Bodyguards, assistants, fans, reporters, they were everywhere. But very few people could actually tell him the truth. Cliff would later say that this was one of the most dangerous parts of celebrity life. Once people stop being honest with you, everything begins to fall apart. But here's what the headlines conveniently left out. Cliff Richard himself almost experienced the same thing. As his fame grew, the pressure became enormous. Every performance had to succeed. Every interview had to sound perfect. Every public appearance was judged. In one interview years later, Cliff admitted there were moments when he wondered if the public loved the real him or simply the image they created in their minds. That emotional struggle connected him to Elvis more than fans ever understood. Both men were symbols, larger than life, untouchable. But underneath the fame, both were human beings trying to survive a world that constantly demanded more from them. Then something happened that made Cliff see Elvis in a completely different way. In the early 1970s, stories about Elvis's health started spreading through the entertainment world. Weight gain, exhaustion, prescription medication issues, strange behavior backstage. At first, many fans ignored the rumors. This was Elvis Presley, the king. People thought he could never fall. But insiders knew things were getting serious. According to reports published after Elvis's death in 1977, his physical condition had declined badly during his final years. Concert footage showed a man still capable of magical performances, but clearly battling something behind the scenes. Some nights he looked energized. Other nights he seemed completely drained. Cliff noticed it too. And what shook him most was not the fame or even the health issues. It was the sadness he sensed around Elvis. A sadness that millions of cheering fans could not erase. That realization stayed with Cliff for decades. Because deep down, he understood something terrifying. Fame could give you money, attention, and applause, while quietly stealing your peace at the exact same time. And just when Cliff thought things could not get more heartbreaking, a private story about Elvis began circulating among people in the music industry. A story so disturbing that many refused to discuss it publicly for years. If you want stories the mainstream media is too afraid to tell, you already know what to do. Subscribe. Now, let's get back to what happened next. By the mid-1970s, the image of Elvis Presley still looked untouchable from the outside. Crowds filled arenas. Fans cried when he walked on stage. Newspapers still called him the king. But behind closed doors, people close to Elvis were seeing a completely different reality unfold. And according to later comments from Cliff Richard, that reality deeply disturbed him. One former member of Elvis's inner circle told reporters years later that the singer often stayed awake through the night, unable to sleep normally. He was exhausted physically and emotionally. His eating habits became unhealthy. Prescription medication had reportedly become a major part of daily life. According to medical reports released after Elvis's death in 1977, multiple drugs were found in his system. The world was shocked, but many insiders quietly admitted they had feared something terrible was coming long before it happened. Still, almost nobody spoke publicly. Why? Because Elvis was more than a celebrity. He was an empire. Millions of dollars depended on concerts, appearances, merchandise, and records. Telling the truth could threaten that machine. So people stayed silent. And that silence may have cost Elvis everything. But that's not even the most painful part. Cliff Richard later reflected on how dangerous fame becomes when a person can no longer trust the people around them. Imagine being surrounded by hundreds of people every single day, managers, assistants, security, fans, but not knowing who truly cares about you. That kind of loneliness can break even the strongest person. And honestly, most of us have felt this at some point. Maybe not with fame or millions of fans, but in our own lives. That feeling of smiling in public while struggling privately. Acting okay because people expect you to be strong. Sound familiar? Keep watching, because what happened next reveals why Cliff never forgot Elvis's final years. In interviews over the years, Cliff spoke carefully whenever Elvis came up. He never wanted to exploit the tragedy. That mattered to him. Unlike tabloids chasing shocking headlines, Cliff understood the human side of the story, because he had seen similar pressure himself. By the 1970s, Cliff Richard had spent years living under constant public attention. Every decision became news. His relationships were questioned. His private life became gossip material. Reporters constantly speculated about his future, his beliefs, even his personal identity. And while Cliff handled fame better than many stars of his era, the pressure still left scars. In a later interview with The Guardian, Cliff admitted that celebrity life can slowly separate people from reality. Fans see perfection, but real life is messy, emotional, complicated. That truth connected him to Elvis in a way most fans never realized. Here's what the headlines conveniently left out. Elvis was not simply collapsing because of fame. According to several biographies and interviews from people around him, he also carried deep emotional pain from childhood, family pressure, and years of impossible expectations. He became trapped inside the character the world demanded from him. Every performance had to feel legendary. Every public appearance had to look magical. Imagine trying to carry that weight every single day for over 20 years. Eventually, cracks started showing everywhere. Concert footage from Elvis's later years became heartbreaking for some fans to watch. One night, he looked energetic and funny. The next, he looked exhausted and distant. But audiences still cheered because they wanted to believe the legend was untouched. Cliff saw something different. He saw a human being losing control while the world kept demanding more. And then came August 16th, 1977, the day Elvis Presley died at just 42 years old. The news exploded across television, radio, and newspapers worldwide. Fans gathered outside Graceland in tears. Radio stations played Elvis songs nonstop. According to historical reports, over 80,000 fans visited Memphis during the days surrounding his funeral. It felt less like the death of a singer and more like the end of an era. For Cliff Richard, the loss hit hard, not because they were best friends. They were not, but because Elvis represented something bigger. A warning, proof that even the most famous person in the world could quietly fall apart while millions watched. And then came the moment that changed everything. Years after Elvis's death, Cliff heard a private story from someone connected to the singer's final days. A story about regret, about exhaustion, and about something Elvis reportedly admitted before it was too late. What Cliff learned stayed buried for decades. For years after Elvis Presley died, rumors spread through the music industry about what his final months were really like. Some stories were exaggerated. Others came from tabloids desperate for attention. But a few accounts came from people who had actually been there, bodyguards, musicians, close friends, and former staff members who witnessed Elvis's decline with their own eyes. And according to people close to Cliff Richard, those stories deeply affected him. One of the biggest rumors centered around Elvis's emotional state near the end of his life. Several former associates later claimed that Elvis felt trapped inside the image the world expected from him. He was still selling out arenas. Fans still screamed his name. But privately, people described a man who felt exhausted, isolated, and emotionally drained. In the 2018 documentary The Searcher, people who worked closely with Elvis describe how fame had become both a blessing and a prison. He could not go anywhere normally. Every move became a spectacle. Every weakness became gossip. Cliff understood that feeling better than most people realized. Because while his own career remained more stable and controlled, he also experienced the strange loneliness celebrity creates. Millions may know your face, but very few know the real person behind it. And over time, that gap can become painful. But here's where the story becomes even darker. According to multiple biographies written after Elvis's death, several people inside his circle allegedly tried to warn him about his health during the mid-1970s. Some urged him to slow down touring. Others worried about the growing dependence on prescription medication. Yet the pressure to keep performing never truly stopped. And then came one private story Cliff reportedly heard years later that he never forgot. The story claimed Elvis once admitted to someone close to him that he missed the simpler days before global fame consumed his life. Before the money, before the endless expectations, before every room felt crowded but emotionally empty. Now, to be clear, some details of these conversations have never been fully verified publicly. But the emotional pattern matches what many former insiders described repeatedly after Elvis's death. And honestly, That may be why Cliff stayed quiet for so long. He did not want to turn another man's pain into entertainment. In interviews across the years, Cliff often spoke respectfully about Elvis, avoiding sensational headlines. That stood out because many celebrities used Elvis's tragedy to gain attention for themselves. Cliff never did that. Instead, he focused on the warning hidden inside the story. Because fame does not protect people from suffering. Sometimes it hides the suffering better. Here's what the headlines conveniently left out. After Elvis died in 1977, the world focused heavily on the shocking details, the drugs, the bathroom, the conspiracy theories, the tabloid chaos. But Cliff reportedly believed people missed the deeper tragedy entirely. A human being had slowly collapsed under years of pressure while the world watched the performance continue. That realization haunted him, especially because Cliff saw how the entertainment industry often repeats the same cycle again and again. Build a star, push them constantly, profit from the fame, then act shocked when the pressure destroys them. And what happened after Elvis's death only made things worse. Books flooded the market. Former friends gave interviews. Private details became public headlines. Some people defended Elvis passionately. Others exposed deeply personal stories for money. The mystery surrounding his final years became almost bigger than his music itself. But through all of it, Cliff Richard stayed unusually careful with his words. Why? Because according to people who followed his career closely, Cliff never wanted to forget that Elvis was once a young man with dreams, fears, insecurities, and enormous talent before the world transformed him into a symbol larger than life. And then came a moment Cliff finally decided to speak more openly. At 85 years old, after decades of silence, he began reflecting publicly on the emotional cost of fame, aging, and survival in the music industry. Fans noticed something different in his tone. Less guarded, more honest, more emotional than before. What he revealed next about Elvis's final years stunned longtime fans completely. At 85 years old, Cliff Richard has outlived many of the biggest stars from his generation. He watched entire eras of music rise and disappear. He saw careers explode overnight and collapse just as fast. But whenever the conversation turns to Elvis Presley, something in Cliff's voice changes. It becomes personal. In several later interviews reflecting on fame and survival, Cliff spoke about how Elvis's story forced him to think carefully about his own life. Not just career decisions, life itself. According to Cliff, one of the saddest parts of Elvis's final years was how difficult it became for him to escape the image people demanded from him. The world wanted the king every single night. Not a tired man, not a struggling human being, not someone overwhelmed by pressure. And that expectation may have slowly crushed him. According to biographers and reports released after Elvis's death, the singer's schedule during his final years remained intense despite worsening health problems. Concerts continued. Public appearances continued. Fans still expected magic every time he stepped on stage. But behind the scenes, things were becoming dangerous. A 2023 retrospective by Biography.com revisited accounts from people inside Elvis's circle who described severe exhaustion, emotional instability, and increasing dependence on medication during the final years of his life. Some insiders later admitted they felt powerless to stop the situation from spiraling. Cliff noticed something important in all of this. People around celebrities often become afraid to say no. That may sound simple, but it changes everything. When a star becomes powerful enough, honesty slowly disappears. Employees fear losing jobs. Managers fear losing money. Friends fear being pushed away. So instead of telling the truth, people protect the image. And according to Cliff, that creates a dangerous illusion where the celebrity becomes trapped inside a world nobody controls anymore. But that's not even the most emotional part. In later reflections, Cliff suggested that Elvis's greatest tragedy was not fame itself. It was the loss of peace. Imagine having millions of fans around the world, endless wealth, private jets, mansions, and global fame, yet still feeling empty inside. That thought stayed with Cliff for decades. Because unlike many celebrities, Cliff intentionally built boundaries around his own life. He stayed away from destructive partying. He focused heavily on faith, discipline, and privacy. In interviews, he has openly admitted that watching what happened to stars like Elvis scared him deeply. It became a warning he never ignored. And honestly, many viewers watching this right now may understand that feeling more than they realize. Sometimes success becomes a trap. People chase money, status, and approval believing happiness waits at the end. But when they finally arrive, they discover the pressure only grows larger. Sound familiar? That may be why Elvis's story still hurts people nearly 50 years after his death. Because underneath the fame, it reflects something painfully human, the fear of losing yourself. And then came a revelation that shocked many longtime fans. Cliff reportedly admitted that part of him believes Elvis might have survived longer if people around him had been more honest earlier. Not cruel, honest. Honest enough to force real change before it became too late. That statement sparked major reactions online. Some fans agreed immediately. Others argued Elvis alone was responsible for his choices. But many people understood exactly what Cliff meant. Sometimes the people closest to powerful stars become too afraid to confront reality until disaster finally arrives. But here is what almost nobody talks about. Even after all these years, Elvis Presley's influence never disappeared. Young artists still study him. Documentaries continue breaking records. Elvis introduced his story to a whole new generation. And perhaps most importantly, his life continues serving as both inspiration and warning at the same time. A man who changed music forever. A man loved by millions. And a man who may have needed real help long before the world realized it. But the final chapter of this story, the part that still emotionally affects Cliff Richard today, is even more heartbreaking than people expected. Even after decades in the spotlight, Cliff Richard says there are moments from his past he can never fully shake. And one of them is the day the world learned that Elvis Presley was gone. It wasn't just a news headline. It felt like something bigger had ended. Cliff later described hearing the announcement as strange and unreal, because Elvis wasn't just another singer to him. He was a symbol of everything the modern music world had become. The rise of global fame, the pressure of nonstop attention, the emotional cost of being worshipped by millions. And suddenly, that symbol was gone at just 42. People gathered outside Graceland in complete silence and shock. Fans cried in the streets. Radio stations stopped regular programming. According to historical reports, even rival artists paused their schedules to process what had happened. It wasn't just sadness. It was disbelief. But for Cliff, something deeper stayed behind. Regret. Not the kind that comes from knowing someone personally every day, but the kind that comes from understanding a story too late. Years later, Cliff admitted that Elvis's death made him reflect on his own life choices more seriously than ever before. Because here's the uncomfortable truth he realized. Fame does not warn you before it changes everything. It happens slowly, quietly, then suddenly. One day you are performing for fans. The next, you are trapped in expectations you can no longer escape. And Elvis's story became the clearest example of that reality. In later interviews, Cliff spoke about how important it became for him to protect his peace. He focused more on privacy, health, and faith. He stepped back whenever life felt too loud. He learned to say no more often than yes. Not because he stopped loving music, but because he understood what happens when a person loses control of their own life. But there is still one moment Cliff never fully speaks about in detail. A private emotional realization he reportedly had years after Elvis's death. According to people close to him, Cliff once admitted that if Elvis had been given more space, more rest, and more honest support, his story might have been completely different. Not necessarily longer fame, but a healthier life. That thought still lingers, because it raises a question nobody in the industry likes to answer. How many other stars are going through the same thing right now? Behind the fame, behind the applause, behind the social media numbers, how many people are silently struggling while the world continues to cheer? Cliff never gives a dramatic answer to that question. Instead, he simply reflects. And what he reflects on is simple but powerful. Fame is not built to protect people. It is built to demand more from them. That is why Elvis's story still matters today. Not just as music history, but as a human warning. A reminder that even the brightest stars can struggle in silence when the pressure becomes too heavy. And for Cliff Richard, that realization never fully fades. Because in many ways, Elvis Presley represents something every performer understands deep down, even if they never say it out loud. The price of being remembered forever can sometimes be forgetting yourself. But here is what almost nobody talks about. There's still one final truth Cliff hinted at in rare interviews, something about legacy, forgiveness, and what Elvis might want the world to understand today. That final reflection changes everything you think you know about this story. And it leads directly to one last question. What do we really owe the people we turn into legends? But that is a story for another time.